Good morning, Frank.
Good morning, Amanda.
We're back to talking about building a brand, the essentials of it.
We are
Today we're going to
nearing the end. We're getting there.
Yeah. Today we're going to talk about one of our favorite things, which is messaging, and how that supports and why it's so important when you're building a brand.
Mm-hmm.
But before we dive in, can you kind of just like recap some of the stepping stones that we've taken to get here?
Yeah, how we got here a little bit. So just to recap on what we've talked about thus far with what we've titled just the essentials of brand building. We've talked about these things sequentially in starting with purpose and vision, and we define that as why do you exist beyond money? Like, what's the purpose of your company existing? Brand identity, second to that, who do you want to be aspirationally? So what is the brand you want to be in the future? Growth goals. So what are the 9 to 18 month kind of objective criteria for measuring success? What would success look like as far as growth, whether that's revenue, size, market share, whatever it might be. Then is category. So just determining what group of solutions, what category of products or brands do we exist within. Those are threefold generally. It's existing. So, toothpaste, right? Very existing category, modified or new. And then last time we've talked about position and point of view. So position just being how you frame your offering based on your point of view on the world or your industry and what you're doing to change that. And then we talked about under that position or point of view should be differentiated, relevant to your audience or in audience, and then sustainable, like you can protect that over time. And that brings us into today's conversations. We talked through those things. Now we're going to talk about messaging, which I'm super excited about.
I am too. So, well, how should we view and use messaging as it relates to or inside of building a brand?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, at least I wanted to communicate in this conversation, is everything we just literally recapped, for the most part, is is strategic, right? Like talking through positioning and things like that. Those are all internal to a certain extent. It's decisions that lead up to who your brand is and kind of what makes up those parts. We talked about this offline a little bit. Something I came across, forgot his name on LinkedIn, but I like the way he put it, is that brand is your total proposition. It includes everything from the products you offer, your services, environments, people, culture, tone, all these different things. It's the whole of all of those parts. And so all of the things we've talked up to this point are kind of those decision-making devices. But messaging is the first and probably most consistent touch point you're creating to now translate all of that into value when you communicate to your customers. It's the first thing you're creating, or tangible kind of like language you're creating, that attempts to take all these conceptual decisions and turn them into communication that your customer reads and understands and can kind of like perceive that for themselves. So I think that's certainly a critical thing to pay attention to. Messaging is certainly still part of that offering. Like some consumer brands you and I probably interact with solely because of the tone that they use and the way they talk, and it's kind of an identity resonance. But again, more importantly, it's so critical because it's the first kind of like translation point. You're taking your brand, all the things you've worked on building, and trying to now communicate that value to your customer. I don't know if you'd have anything to add to that.
Well, I think you're 110% on point with everything that you're saying. I completely agree. I think like messaging, and I know we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but to me, it's just so critical because you might have a perfect organization that the market needs, that has really good intentions and a high success rate. But if your messaging is bad, it's going to put people off. You're not going to communicate like any of the good things about your brand. Mm-hmm. And it's just so important. So even like, again, I'll try to contain my thoughts as we go through our conversation. But when it comes to good messaging, like how would you define that? Like what's good messaging?
Yeah. Well, the first thing you just mentioned too, that kind of leads us right into that next point, is accurately reflecting your brand strategy. So one of the biggest, and we'll talk about pitfalls maybe a little bit today too, but one of the biggest pitfalls is we've worked so hard on developing, like doing market research and figuring out where target audience is and how we should structure or frame this offering, what would make sense. And then you get to your messaging and it's written in a way that doesn't reflect any of that at all. And, some of that can seem like semantics, but for the most part, it's not. For the most part, it's absolutely critical that the words you use in your messaging reflect all the work you've done as a brand. What is the true value of your product? What is the true value of your service? What is the, the perception you need to create in order to build your brand? So that's like number one, I think, is making sure that if we're attempting to translate that, it has to be accurate. It has to be driven by that strategy. The second is a term I came across fairly recently. It's not mine, is language market fit. I like that idea because of how it was described. It's not a new concept, but it's a new way of thinking about it. Is, are you using language that describes the problem and the ideal solution in the way that your audience would? So the way the market's speaking about a problem, or at least about a wished upon solution, use those words. Use words that your market's likely using. I liked the way this was put a little while ago. Is, to them, it should feel like you've been reading their emails. And I thought, like, when I came across, I've been a copywriter for a long time. I came across that and I was like, that is such a simple and yet profound kind of way of thinking through messaging. Is like, what would you and I discuss in an email that's like problematic if there was a solution that was being presented to us?
That is so good. I love that.
Yeah, it's such a tangible, like, helpful way of thinking through that. So that's one thing I'd mention. The last couple is that it's fit for your current stage of growth. So we actually wrote an article a while ago called Nike's brand positioning, just do it, but differently. And I think this is kind of where we get into that conversation. Is people will look at these really, really large, successful brands, especially on the consumer side, Nike, Allbirds, or B2B Salesforce, and look at these companies who have built ubiquitous brand awareness over the last, some of them 10, 15 years, some of them way longer than that, 50, 60 years at this point. But with that comes a problem. It's like, copying that messaging is not always going to work. Because if you're a newer brand, particularly, we work with a lot of B2B brands in the SaaS or technology space, you just have to be really, really clear about what it is your product is giving someone. Very, almost like much more based on the feature and how that solves a problem, and then the benefit. So I guess a rule of thumb I would go with is, like, the less brand awareness you have, the more simple and straightforward you need to be. So I'll use Peloton as an example for this. Back when they first came out, their messaging was very just straightforward. It was like, cycle in, I may get this wrong, but cycle in the comfort of your own living room or something like that, right? And sure, they had great photography and design, but it was really clear. It's like, yeah, this is a cycling bike. I could do it at home, maybe with a community. Now we jump forward, quite a few years, and it's something, it's very aspirational. It's like, go farther together. And it's really built around this whole communal idea. People love those leaderboards and things like that. But it's because they've built a ubiquitous brand now. Everyone knows who Peloton is. So they don't have to be really, really tangible to the language. Same with a company like Nike or Salesforce, or these kind of like household names to a certain extent. And even then, they're trying to communicate value, because for Peloton now, it's very communal. That's the big value of being part of Peloton. It's like, you see your friends or other people all over the world, nation, whatever it is. Also a lot of other value points. So that's one big one. And the last one, I'm stealing this, I always will, from Marty Neumeyer, someone I think who's done really well helping brands build themselves up, is answering the following questions and making it really simple. Who are you? What do you do? And why does it matter? Who are you? What do you do? And why does it matter? Particularly those last two, what do you do? And why does it matter? If you can answer that through your messaging, you're going to have a lot of success. So, again, I don't know if you have any other thoughts to add to that, or if I missed out on anything, but those are some key things I usually think through.
Yeah, I think it's great. And one of the things that, like, we've seen kind of a culture shift in probably the past maybe 5 to 10 years is that the market responds to messaging, and they know that it's happening and they're okay with it. And so if you represent your brand well with your words and you are trustworthy, like, people will choose a brand because of their messaging. Just like you said, they will, we choose brands because of their tone, or we resonate with a brand because it sounds like they've been reading our emails. Like, the market is okay with that. And it's like, that's awesome. Like, people are choosing brands based on their personality, which shows up in their messaging. And I think exactly like what you said, I like that language market fit idea too, because, like, people express themselves in words, and that's how we learn and how we connect with each other. And that's how people connect with the brand, is the words that they use in their messaging.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it too, is like that element about personality and messaging. I think it used to be reserved for much more, the D2C market craze that's happened over I mean, now it's not a craze, it's actually growing quite old at this point, that whole disruption of consumer brands.
Mhm.
We've talked about this before, maybe in one of these videos, is I think it's worth noting that there's quite a bit of evidence that whatever happens on the consumer side tends to have a kind of like a lagging effect in the B2B world. I
Yeah.
would say probably anywhere between like 2 and 3 years, maybe sometimes 5, depending on what it is. But we're also seeing a lot of B2B companies because people are they identify with their career so much that now having a personality and a tone and a brand as a B2B company is becoming a lot more critical than it used to be. Right.
Mhm.
And I think that line is becoming a little bit more blurry between kind of like life and lifestyle and then the B2B products you use. So I think that's super important for B2B companies to be aware of as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be the thoughts I have around the elements we're looking for.
Well, what are some of the when messaging falls short, like what are some of the pitfalls that people or that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of the biggest pitfalls. One that I'm actually going to add is, I think first and foremost, is making it all about yourself, and just talking about how cool you guys are as a company. There certainly are times and places where people want to know about your like at some point they want to know like, all right, you've talked about me, I want to know a little bit
Mhm.
more about you, right? But at the same time, most of your messaging and most of the value that you're trying to communicate should be based on the customer and the customer's problem. And we've used StoryBrand as a framework and a methodology. We also use other frameworks, but across the board, we generally lean towards like making it about the customer's problem, about their life, because you just play a very small role in what they do. So making it about them. A couple of other key ones: too much information too soon. I can say that this is probably the biggest thing we come up against is how do we communicate everything our brand does? Well, we do this and we do this and we do this. That's all great. In fact, I think brands are very complex creatures, so to speak. And I've said this before, but a brand is the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. There's a lot of moving pieces in a brand that make it unique and distinct, or similar to like your personality versus my personality. There's a lot of these unique attributes, but those things need to be looked at like layers. At first, you really just need to communicate the biggest idea of what you do, and that should be really simple: one problem, one solution. Then as you get people interested, you can talk about, hey, we also do this, and we kind of back that up through this. And that's really what positioning is to a certain extent. It's really what you make your biggest idea, or your the idea you own at the highest level. So just making that really simple. What are you going to be known for? The rest of the information can come later. It can come in ads. It can come down on your website if we're talking, technical application. But avoiding doing too much too soon and trying to fit everything in. I could spend months talking about that as a pitfall, because I think that's what weakens messaging.
Mhm.
I don't know why this came up, but I wrote something yesterday after having a conversation with someone, maybe it's on LinkedIn, Twitter, both, about how copy costs or words are not free in copywriting, right? Like if I insert a descriptor or try and be really, really descriptive in my copy, everything I put in there is going to take away from something else in that sentence, right? We can't add too much, or else it just dilutes the whole thing. We need to be really clear about what we do. That leads into clarity, just being really clear about what you do. Adding, again, the more ubiquitous your brand, the more awareness you have, people already know what you do to a certain extent. Yeah, you can make an assumption that everyone knows that Nike makes shoes, right? So they don't have to literally put like, we make shoes. In fact, they probably wouldn't be the company today if they were doing that. But
Yeah.
more important, they're so focused on inspiration and things like that, and they constantly drive that home. Last would be inconsistency. So you write your broad message and it translates your brand position well, and then all of a sudden your social media coordinator, your marketing team, your email marketing all has kind of these disparate ideas about what you do and starts putting out a different message. That's really, really harmful. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have different messages for different layers of your company, but you should be able to identify, even if you're talking about a very technical level of your offering, you should be able to easily loop that back into your overall brand. Even if you have parent brands, sub brands, and then each one of those sub brands has a different product line, you should easily be able to relate the value of that back to your overall position, right? It shouldn't be distinct. And then I think bad copy. This is more so for like teams that don't have a copywriter or don't have a copy team trying to do that internally. I'm not just saying that because I've been a copywriter before and I've just seen it. I know the harm that can come from bad copy and not having it. It's a skill set. It's a skill set, just like design, right? If you weren't a designer, hopefully at a medium enterprise company, you wouldn't attempt to design things yourself. You'd hire a designer because it's a skill set. Copywriting is a skill set. It's not just writing words on paper. It's a skill set that's able to translate value in a way that resonates with your customer really clearly. So not investing in that is certainly a bad decision, I think, for most companies.
I think so too. And like, we live in a cancel culture today. And so one of the pitfalls that I see is that brands create messaging or campaigns or whatever around an initiative that they feel like resonates with their market. So that could be diversity or, environmental concerns, even political things, but then their brand doesn't back it up. Like, you're going to do a lot of damage to your brand if your messaging isn't, and you've already talked about this. So one of your first things, it actually needs to represent your brand. So you can't do messaging for messaging's sake because you think that your audience is going to like it. Your company and your brand and your organization need to back that up. Because otherwise, like, if, the things that you mentioned, absolutely, like, and also like the not being accurate with your messaging. If you have bad messaging, it's going to damage your reputation and it's going to be harder to regain it. And I think that's one of the things that's super important. Even if you have like a typo or you just don't speak authentically to your audience, it can hurt. It can hurt that. So yeah,
that's a great point. You really like analogy, so I'll use an analogy to drive that home too. Is like, it's the same. How we've talked about it before is like, if your brand, the total proposition of what you do, the essence of who you are, if we think about that in human form, if that's my my soul or whatever, people describe that, it's not seeable. You can't see that, but you can see my skin and you can see the clothes that I wear. The skin and the clothes in this scenario is your messaging. It's the thing that represents the outward form of who you are. And if I if I was someone who, let's say, was really quiet and enjoyed cooking and reading, all that's great, and then I wore like biker gear, like motorcycle Harley gear, there would be a disconnect in who people wouldn't know how to interact with me. Oh, you're a biker. No. Oh, okay. Right. Like, there'd be, and maybe that's a bad analogy to a certain extent, but when we talk about authenticity in brands, we're talking about what you just said. It doesn't mean you have to tell people your accounting, the back end office of your accounting numbers. Some brands do stuff like that, but it's more so like, hey, is there consistency in who you say you are? Is what you say matching up with who you actually are? I think Patagonia does a really good job. They're an easy example of like, they say a lot of things about climate change and all that stuff, but that's more so a reflection of what they're already doing. They donate more than any other company. They're constantly looking at these things, and there's debates about that, but for the most part, they back up that messaging with who they are. They don't write the messaging first and then act. They act and then they just use messaging to communicate that action.
100%.
That's good.
That was a great analogy, Frank. I was imagining you in Harley gear and like leather.
Oh gosh,
that's
a bad picture.
Could never picture you wearing that. Well, how can people do it? How can people develop good messaging?
There's a lot of really disparate skill sets that we could sit here and talk about, but the reality is, I would say just brushing up on some frameworks on really the conceptual approach to messaging would be good for anyone that runs a team or is on the brand side or company side. Building a story brand, the story brand framework, that's something we've relied on for a long time. So it's something a lot of companies have relied on. It's just a really good methodology. There's a ton of them out there, but I think they do a really good job of making the customer the focus of your kind of brand story. And then there's other resources just to learn, like, hey, how do you make a thought resonate with someone? Made to Stick is a classic that's really good to read about how to communicate ideas. There's tons of them out there that people could read. Secondly, though, on execution, workshops. So go to, workshop. We have our own workshops. You could ask us about it. You can do that as privately. You can go to, you can look online. There's different workshops that copy teams and companies will hold for stuff like that, where you could work on it with your team or have someone come to you. But lastly, I would say hire someone to do it for the most part. If you're listening to this and you're not a copywriter, or you don't have a copywriter on your team, someone doing that, well worth the investment. And that doesn't have to be us. We're trying to make this just helpful content. I'm not just saying that so people know that we do that. Hire a copywriter that you research, has done good work, stuff like that. But it is a skill set. It's not just putting words down on a page. Otherwise, everyone would write poetry and be rich, right? Like it's similar to that. Like, how do you elicit emotion? What are the words? What are the tool sets? What are the structures of wording that you use? What fits for a campaign that doesn't fit for a subject line on your email? Like, there is a strategy behind that, and you should hire someone who has built their career or their skill sets around those. And it's certainly something you can lose, even if you used to. Like, I used to do a lot more copywriting. I like to think I'm a decent writer still, but at the same time, doing that day in and day out, ever since I've stopped doing that as frequently, I can certainly tell it's just not as natural. It's certainly harder. So yeah, that'd be my biggest form of advice. All the things we talked about, make sure your messaging is hitting on. But as far as actually building it, working with someone who knows how to do it is probably the best bet.
100%. I could not agree with you more on that, for sure.
But I
Well,
should
this
make
was-
clear, we do that. And if you want us to do that, let us know. We're always for that. But yeah, at the end of the day, just make sure that you have someone who can help you do it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for grabbing time today. It was fun to talk about messaging with you.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Always a treat. Talk soon.